Simple ways to study that just make sense.
The first English study technique to cover is called a module book. And a module book starts with an A4 book first, and up the top you write the module or thing that you're studying and the title. So for example here, this is Module B, Close Study of Literature, and it's on Feed, which is a HSC prescribed text. On the first page, we get through some of the specifics. So up the top, we write the title. We make sure that we include the author, in this case for Feed, M.T. Anderson, published in 2002. On this page, we make sure we include these four things. The audience, so that is, who was the book written for? So an example here, it's a young adult book for Feed, so that means about 12 to 25. The genre, where does it fit in the literature circles? In this instance, it's sci-fi, it's also dystopian, and it also has satire. What is the narration type? Who is the person who tells the story and how do they tell it? So for example, Feed is a first-person narrated story from Titus's perspective, and Titus is the protagonist. And what language choices has the author made in writing the story? So in this example, think about what is unique to the text language. What sets this text apart from all the other ones that you may have read or have heard about? So an example here for Feed would be slang, colloquialisms, informal language, casual or dialogue, interjections and sentence fragments, neologisms, and fractured language. So they're all examples of the language choices that have been used by the author in Feed. On the second page, we look at the author itself. So an example of an author for Feed is M.T. Anderson. And on this page, we add information about the author that could help explain some of the motivations for writing the story. And below that is what yours could look like. So you could have a photo of the author. Dot points are fine for listing who the author is, what they're about, and their motivations. So an example, M.T. Anderson was born in 1968. He's an American, but he lived in Italy when he was little because his dad worked for the US Army on radar systems. As a teen, he was keen on writing stories and comics, but also wrote computer code. He is fascinated by ruins of old cities and societies. And below that, I've written, take this further. The students who want to achieve the best bands will think about how they can take this information further and transform it or present it in a way that will help with their analysis. So if you're thinking of doing that, you need to think of how could this information influence the author's writing. So how could what have happened here influenced what they wrote? On our third page, we look at the idea of context. And we look primarily at the four types of context up the top: social, personal, cultural, and historical. For social context, we think about the way the features of a society in a text is set and the impacts of this on the meaning. For personal context, we mean how the author lives, how the text's audience lives, or the lives of the characters in the text. For Feed, I would encourage you to focus on the last one, and mainly to focus simply on the protagonist. What is the personal context of the protagonist of your text? Cultural context is the way of life for the characters, and this can include things like religion, nationality, food, dress, education, the value of education, their manners, the way they speak, their language, and their dialect. And the cultural context is particularly important if the author is trying to critique the society. And that is a big hint here for Feed. Historical context, rather, is the events or people in the text that make the social and cultural context make sense. So, for example, the cultural and social context occur because of what has happened historically in the text. I would always recommend using a table to write these contexts down. And you would take it further by writing how you think this might have been influenced by the author's own context. And here just below I've written what it could look like. So for an example, you could have social context. In the text, the social context for feed, for example, is a futuristic dystopian country. It's the US. We talk about consumerism, we talk about the influence of technology, etc. And then here, for social, we think about how does the author's own context have influenced what he would have written. So then we can link it back to what we know about the author, that he spent time in Italy with his father working on radar systems during the Cold War, and that he was fascinated with technology and particularly computer code. So we can draw those assumptions and make connections between what the society is like in that text to what the author has experienced. On the next page, it's a rather short one. Here we just simply talk about setting, and we only briefly outline the setting of the novel. And in particular, we only focus on the major settings. And for setting, dot points is absolutely fine. So an example of a setting dot point in feed could be dystopian urban world, or environmental collapse, or futuristic US, or people living in a highly congested urban environment or with a high population density. Anything like that will tell us a setting. The next page gives you some choice. We talk about plot here, and that can be done in two ways. It can be done via a timeline, simply like that. You might draw a timeline going across 2 pages, and you would simply dot point and outline the parts of a text that are important to the plot. Or the second would be Freytag's triangle, or narrative structure as you might know it. It looks like that. And again, you could put that over 2 pages, and then you would map out, you would annotate the parts of a narrative that are important. Students that are aiming for higher bands will take it further. They will look for things that are the coda. So what is the message of the text? What is the text's aim to teach its audience? From setting, we look at characters. Here, on this page, a simple character web will suffice. We think about the interactions between characters, and the best way forward is to start with the protagonist. So my purple circle here is my protagonist. Let's say that's Titus. To the left, we have these squares, and we're showing the connection here. These squares might represent his friends, and I'll write their names in there, and then we can talk about that connection and those interactions. The orange circles, let's say this is Violet, and this is Violet's dad. So what we're doing is we're talking about the interactions between characters and how they influence who each other are. Additionally, it's important for us to make sure that we clearly know what the character is and who they are about. Character descriptions are an important part of understanding a novel, but at the same time, I wouldn't invest too much time in them. Just focus on the big characters. So for example, it might be the protagonist. We might just write their name and what they look like. And we might only do that for a couple of other major characters in the text. Students aiming for a higher band will take it further by writing as well, how does the way a character look influence their story or influence their society in the story? An example from feed might be the lesions on the characters. One of our last points is themes, and on this page it's rather short. All we do here is make a list of themes of the text. So, for example, a theme in feed could be overconsumption, or consumerism, or technology, or globalism, globalization, advertising, corporate power, ethics and morality. Any of those things count as themes for feed. On the subsequent pages after this, we deconstruct and analyse each theme. And what we here need when we deconstruct are quotes, techniques, effects and analysis. An example of what that might look like is here. So when we look at the theme of consumerism, we might look at this technique here. Visual imagery, the way that images are created in the text. An example of visual imagery here might be the way Violet was described. And then you add a quote there to prove that that is a technique used. What we do here is then analyse. Analyse the effect of this technique on this example on the audience. And we make sure that we are using technique, example, and analysis. Because what we want to do is we want to spill the tea, T-E-A. So we want to make sure that we're talking clearly about how these things influence this theme. And then how this theme and these things influence then our story as a whole. What your job will be after this is to repeat this for each theme. And you want about 4 or 5 tea spills for each theme. Because here is where you will get your quotes, your techniques and analysis for an exam. And that is
Simple ways to study that just make sense.